Picture this: a marble corridor in one of San Francisco's most prestigious universities. The kind of hallway where the silence is expensive, where your footsteps sound like a statement and the portraits on the walls stare at you like they're keeping score. A man walks in like he owns the place. Because, in his mind, he does. He's wearing a charcoal blazer. His shoes cost more than most people's rent checks. He doesn't look left. He doesn't look right. He walks like a man who has never once in his adult life been told to wait. And then he sees her, a woman, sitting quietly at a desk near the corridor. No nameplate, no badge, just a woman with her head bent over a document, reading something with the calm focus of someone who has all the time in the world. He barely glances at her. Why would he? He drapes his coat over her chair. He rattles off instructions without slowing his stride. Coffee, black, projector in room 214 hold his calls. The kind of words you say to furniture that listens. She looks up, just for a moment. And there's something in her eyes, not anger, not hurt. Something quieter than both of those things. Something that looks, if you're watching closely enough, like the expression of a chess player who has just watched her opponent make the move she was waiting for. She takes his coat. She doesn't say a word. And that small, silent moment is the beginning of the end of everything Reginald Ashford Belmont spent 20 years building. This is a story about power, about assumption, about the dangerous habit of deciding who matters before you've bothered to find out who you're standing in front of. And it is a story about a woman who had every reason to correct him immediately and chose instead to wait, stay with us. Because before this story is over, everything you think you know about who holds power in that marble corridor is going to be turned completely on its head. And the lesson waiting at the end of this, it's one none of us can afford to miss. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There is a particular kind of invisibility that the world assigns to certain women without their permission. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with hostility necessarily, not always. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest, most ordinary-looking moments. A man who speaks to you without making eye contact. A room that introduces everyone except you. An assumption so fast it doesn't even register as a thought, just a reflex. You are the help. You are the background. You are not the one making decisions here. Dr. Solene Marchetti-Akafer had encountered this invisibility before. She had encountered it as a graduate student at Berkeley, when advisors remembered every male colleague's dissertation topic, but consistently forgot hers. She had encountered it as an associate dean at a university in Portland, where she once sat through an entire board meeting before someone realized she was not the note-taker but the chair. She had encountered it so many times, in so many corridors, in so many rooms, that she had developed a philosophy about it, not a bitter one but a precise one. She had learned that invisibility, when you chose it deliberately, became something else entirely. It became a lens, a way of seeing people as they truly were, not as they performed themselves to be. So when Reginald Ashford Belmont handed her his coat that Tuesday morning in October, something shifted inside her, not into anger, into clarity. But here is what we don't yet know. Here is what is going to keep you watching. Why, in those 3 weeks that followed, did Solene not simply correct the mistake? She is a provost. She has the authority to walk into any room on that campus and make her title known. So why did she let it continue? What was she looking for? What did she need to see? And what about Reginald himself, this man who climbed from nothing, who earned everything he has through genuine brilliance and relentless work? Is he simply a villain in this story, or is he something more complicated? What happens to a person who spends decades fighting to be taken seriously and somewhere along the way starts doing to others what was once done to him? There is a faculty assistant named Petra Voss, 28 years old, sharp as a razor, the kind of woman who knows where every body is buried in that building simply because nobody bothers to watch what they say around her. Petra sees things. Petra knows things. And Petra has been watching Reginald Ashford Belmont for 2 years with an expression that sits somewhere between resignation and contained fury. What does Petra know? And why has she never said it out loud? There is also the Westhaven Foundation, and a clause buried deep in a gift agreement that almost nobody ever reads. A clause that gives the provost enormous power over where $5 million ultimately lands. Does Reginald know about this clause? Has anyone told him? And if they haven't, why not? And then there is the question at the very center of this story, the one that will not let you go once it takes hold. What happens when the person you've been dismissing turns out to be the one person you needed most? What happens in that room, that specific, unavoidable, witness-filled room, when the truth finally surfaces? The fog over San Francisco doesn't announce itself either. It just rolls in, quiet and total, until everything looks different than it did before. Until you can't remember quite how bright it was. And that is exactly what is about to happen to Reginald Ashford Belmont. Something is rolling in, and he has no idea. To understand what is about to happen, you have to understand where both of these people came from. Because this is not a simple story about a bad man and a good woman. It is a story about two people who both clawed their way out of difficult places, and what the climb did to each of them. Reginald Ashford Belmont was born in the Oak Park neighborhood of Sacramento to a woman named Claudette, who worked double shifts cleaning offices in the CalPERS building 5 nights a week. His father left when Reginald was 4, not dramatically, not with a scene. He simply stopped coming home one January, and Claudette quietly redistributed the grocery budget and never mentioned him again. Reginald grew up understanding that survival was a performance, that you had to look like you belonged somewhere before anyone would let you in. He was, from the very beginning, ferociously intelligent. The kind of student whose teachers wrote notes home not because he was trouble, but because they didn't quite know what to do with someone who finished the assigned reading by Wednesday and had already moved on to the supplementary texts by Friday. He won a partial scholarship to UC Davis, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and graduated with a double major in biology and philosophy in 3 years. His thesis on the ethics of genetic data ownership circulated informally among faculty before it was even formally submitted. A Stanford professor read it and reached out. By the time Reginald was 30, he had his doctorate, 2 peer-reviewed publications, and a junior faculty position at a mid-tier university in the East Bay. He was on his way. He knew it. Everyone around him knew it. But knowing you're on your way and feeling safe on that journey are 2 entirely different things. And Reginald, for all his brilliance, never quite shed the fear that the rug could be pulled, that someone would look more closely and decide the scholarship was a mistake, that the room he'd fought his way into would eventually ask him to leave. That fear, that deep, specific, structural fear that lives in the bones of people who grew up with nothing, never fully dissolved. It just transformed. It transformed into control, into the need to establish at every turn that he was the most prepared person in the room, the most credentialed, the most indispensable. Over the years, as he rose associate dean at 37, full dean at 44, that need calcified into a kind of arrogance that he himself could no longer distinguish from confidence. He had forgotten, somewhere in the ascent, that confidence built from fear is not the same as confidence built from security. One expands to include others. The other protects itself by diminishing them. The people who worked for him knew this. His assistant, a meticulous and quietly devastating young woman named Petra Voss, had a small notebook she kept in her desk drawer, not for malicious reasons, but because she was the kind of person who processed difficulty by documenting it. 2 years of small incidents, accumulated like sediment. The colleague whose idea Reginald presented as his own in a faculty meeting. The junior researcher he had embarrassed in front of a donor. The way he spoke to the facility's staff versus the way he spoke to the board of trustees. 2 entirely different registers, 2 entirely different people, depending on the perceived value of the audience. Petra had never shown the notebook to anyone. She wasn't sure she ever would, but she had it. Across the campus, in the temporary second-floor office that still smelled faintly of fresh paint, Dr. Soline Marchetti-Ackefer was building a different kind of record. Soline's story began 3 blocks from the Pacific Ocean, in a small house on Taraville Street in San Francisco's outer Sunset neighborhood. Her mother, Delphine, was a Creole woman from New Orleans who had come to California in her 20s chasing a love that didn't last but stayed for the fog, which reminded her, she always said, of the Spanish moss back home, something beautiful that hung in the air and softened the edges of everything. Her father, Marco, ran a small alteration shop on Irving Street for 30 years, the kind of shop where the sewing machine ran from 7 in the morning until 8 at night, and the radio played jazz that nobody had requested. Solene grew up between two languages, two cultures, and two kinds of quiet. Her mother's meditative Creole stillness and her father's Italian-American busyness, the kind that expressed love through labor. She was an exceptional student, but what set her apart was not the grades, it was the observation. From the time she was small, Solene had an almost unnerving capacity to watch a situation and understand its architecture, to see not just what was happening but why, and what would happen next if nothing changed. She earned her bachelor's degree at San Francisco State on a merit scholarship, her master's at Columbia, her doctorate at Berkeley. She wrote her dissertation on the politics of institutional access, on the ways universities, often unconsciously, replicated the same hierarchies they claimed to dismantle. It was a quiet, rigorously documented, slightly devastating piece of academic work that won a national prize and quietly made her professionally radioactive at 3 institutions that recognized themselves in her data. She spent years as an associate provost at a university in Chicago, then as an academic vice president at a small but respected liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest. She was appointed to Caldwell Hargrove's provost position after a search committee that interviewed 11 candidates, 6 men and 5 women, returned a unanimous recommendation. She was, in the committee's formal language, the candidate with the most exceptional combination of strategic vision and institutional integrity they had encountered in the search. She moved back to San Francisco in February. She found a rental apartment in the inner Sunset, not far from where she grew up. She started work in March. And because her office was under renovation and the directory update had fallen through an administrative crack, she spent her first several months at Caldwell Hargrove in an unusual kind of limbo, visibly present on campus but invisible in the institutional sense. Unnamed, unidentified, watching. It was, she would later reflect, the most useful period of professional education she had ever received. And it was into this period, this deliberate, observational, fog-quiet period, that Reginald Ashford Belmont walked with his coffee and his coat, and his absolute certainty that he already knew who everyone around him was. He did not. The Westhaven Foundation gift had been in negotiation for 14 months. Reginald had personally cultivated the relationship. He had flown to their offices in Palo Alto 4 times. He had submitted a proposal that ran to 87 pages. He had leveraged every connection, every favor, every piece of reputational capital he had accumulated across 20 years in academic administration, and it had worked. In September, the foundation had verbally committed to the $5 million endowment. The formal announcement was scheduled for the 3rd week of November. A ceremony in Hargrove Hall's grand reception room, attended by the university's board of trustees, major donors, faculty leadership, and a representative from the foundation itself. Reginald had already drafted his remarks. He had already, though he had not told anyone this, researched the process for getting one's name formally attached to an endowed chair. He had been rehearsing, in the privacy of his own imagination, the particular feeling of permanence that came from having your legacy carved into an institution. The Reginald Ashford Belmont Chair in Bioethical Governance. He turned the phrase over in his mind the way a person turns a river stone in their palm. What he did not know, what no one had thought to tell him, because the provost's role in Westhaven gifts had never been relevant before, because no provost at Caldwell Hargrove had ever invoked the clause on page 42, was that Solene held an extraordinary amount of power over this moment. She had read the full gift agreement on her second day as provost. She read every document placed on her desk in full. It was a habit she had developed early in her career. After watching an institution, she worked for sign an agreement that seemed generous on the surface and revealed itself to be deeply constraining 2 years later when the fine print became operative. Page 42 of the Westhaven Agreement contained 3 paragraphs that the university's general counsel had flagged with a small note that said simply, "Unusual clause, unlikely to be invoked." Soling had read those 3 paragraphs 4 times. The clause gave the provost the authority to recommend restructuring of the endowment placement, to redirect the gift to a different department, or request that the foundation reconsider the receiving institution entirely, within 30 days of the formal announcement. If the provost determined that placement in the original department did not align with the institution's current strategic priorities or culture of excellence, the foundation had included it, according to a footnote, because of a painful experience a decade earlier in which a gift had been placed with a department that subsequently experienced a major institutional scandal. They had wanted a backstop, a human backstop with authority. That backstop was now sitting in a second-floor office holding a coat that wasn't hers to hold. The morning after the coat incident, a Wednesday, cool and gray, the bay invisible behind a wall of fog, Soling had her first extended conversation with Petra Voss. It happened naturally. Petra had come to the second floor to deliver some documents, recognized Soling from a brief faculty photograph she'd once seen in an old newsletter, and stopped. There was a pause, just a beat, and then Petra said quietly that she hoped the provost was settling in well. And Soling said she was, and asked Petra how long she had worked for Dean Ashford Belmont. And something in the way Petra answered, not the words, but the particular flatness with which she chose them, the careful absence of warmth, told Soling everything she needed to begin understanding. She did not ask Petra to tell her anything. She simply left a door open in the metaphorical sense by saying, if Petra ever wanted to talk about the departmental culture, Soling's door, even the temporary, unmarked one, was open. 3 days later Petra came. She did not bring the notebook. Not yet. She brought something simpler, a memory. She told Soling about a junior researcher named Desmond Farquhar Cole, a 29-year-old postdoctoral fellow who had come to Reginald 3 months prior with documented evidence that the lab's equipment budget had been quietly reallocated, that money intended for his research project had been redirected, without his knowledge or consent, to a project more visibly associated with Reginald's own name. Desmond had brought spreadsheets. He had brought emails. He had been careful and professional and, to his enormous credit, had not been accusatory. He had simply asked for an explanation. Reginald had told him, in front of 2 colleagues, that junior researchers who didn't understand how departmental budgets worked should perhaps reconsider whether they were suited for research leadership. He had not addressed the spreadsheets. He had not addressed the emails. He had simply, and this was the part that sat in Petra's chest like a cold stone, smiled and moved on. Desmond had resigned 2 weeks later. He was now at a university in Seattle. His project, stripped of its original budget, had been quietly absorbed into the department's general research fund. Soling listened to all of this without expression. She thanked Petra. She asked one question: was there documentation? Petra said she thought there might be. And then, because the revelation at the center of this story has not yet arrived, because Reginald still does not know who he is dealing with, things continued. He stopped by the second-floor corridor twice more that week. Once to ask the woman at the desk to print a document for him. Once to ask her to confirm a meeting time with someone from the foundation. Both times, Soling did what he asked. Both times, she said nothing about who she was. The universe, watching, held its breath. And then came the Monday morning 3 weeks after the coat incident. The morning that everything changed. Reginald had called an emergency faculty meeting for 9 o'clock. Something about the announcement timeline. The foundation had moved the ceremony up by 4 days, and there were logistics to sort. He walked into the third-floor conference room with the particular energy of a man who has already decided what's going to happen and simply needs the room to confirm it. The room was arranged around a long oval table. There were 12 people seated, and at the head of the table, in the chair that Reginald himself had intended to occupy, sat Solene Marchetti-Acaffer. She was wearing a dark blazer. Her reading glasses were on. There was a folder open in front of her, and she was writing something in the margin of the top page with a precise, unhurried hand. She looked up when Reginald entered. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have been expecting. "Dean Ashford Belmont," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "I believe you know everyone here. For those who may not have had the chance to meet me yet, I'm Solene Marchetti-Acaffer. I'm the Provost." The room was absolutely silent. Every person at that table had already met her. Every person at that table already knew who she was. And every person at that table had, over the past 3 weeks, noticed with varying degrees of discomfort that the dean of their school had been treating the provost like a member of the support staff. Reginald stood in the doorway. His coffee was in his hand. His face did something complicated, a rapid, terrible reconfiguration, like watching a building realize too late that its foundation was not where it thought it was. And that's when he realized it wasn't a dream. If this story has your heart racing, comment "I'm still watching." Let's see who's truly following till the end. The next 72 hours in Reginald Ashford Belmont's life were the longest of his professional career. He managed the room. He was good at managing rooms. It was, perhaps, the skill he had most meticulously cultivated. He recovered his composure within seconds, said something gracious and appropriately self-deprecating about the pleasure of finally formally meeting the provost, took a seat that was not at the head of the table, and proceeded to run the meeting with his usual precision. Nobody in that room was fooled, but they were all, in their various ways, grateful for the fiction. Academic institutions run on managed fiction. It is their primary fuel. After the meeting, he went to his office and sat behind his desk for 11 minutes without moving. His assistant Petra, who had a gift for reading the atmospheric pressure of a room that rivaled any meteorologist's, brought him coffee without being asked, and then found reasons to be in other parts of the building. What was happening inside Reginald in those 11 minutes was not simple. It would be easier to tell this story if he were simply a villain calculating damage control. But the truth was more complicated, and truer stories always are. What was happening was a kind of archaeology. A rapid, involuntary excavation of the past 3 weeks, every interaction reconstructing itself in new and devastating light. The coat. He had handed her his coat. He had told her the provost, the highest academic officer at this institution, the woman who held institutional authority over his department, his budget, his tenure processes, and now he was beginning to understand his endowment to get him a black coffee. The nausea that moved through him was not just embarrassment. It was the specific, sickening nausea of a man who had spent 20 years climbing out of a world where people looked through him, and had just looked through someone else in exactly the same way. He recognized it. That was the part that made it unbearable. He recognized the shape of what he had done because he knew the shape of what had been done to him. And somewhere in the machinery of his ambition and his fear, he had let it happen anyway. But recognition is not the same as reckoning. And Reginald, for all his intelligence, had spent decades becoming very, very good at the work of not reckoning. He called his university liaison at the Westhaven Foundation that afternoon. "Just to check in," he said, "just to confirm the timeline." The liaison was warm, reassuring. Everything was on track. The announcement ceremony was now scheduled for Friday of the following week. The foundation representative, a woman named Callista O'Dwyer Remington, would be flying in from Palo Alto. The provost's office had already been in contact with Ms. O'Dwyer Remington's assistant to coordinate the formal paperwork. Reginald set his phone down. The provost's office had already been in contact. He spent the next 3 days in a state of performance that deserves a certain kind of acknowledgement, because it was genuinely extraordinary. He was gracious in every hallway encounter with Solene. He was visible in his investment in departmental excellence. He called Desmond Farquhar Cole's new supervisor in Seattle, in what he told himself was a gesture of professional goodwill, and learned that Desmond's project was thriving. He arranged a faculty lunch to which he had never previously thought to invite the junior researchers. He asked Petra, carefully, as if he were making routine conversation, whether the departmental culture surveys from last spring had ever been formally compiled. Petra told him yes. They had been compiled. She knew right where they were. There was a quality to Petra's helpfulness in those 3 days that was perfectly, precisely, absolutely correct. She was professional. She was efficient. She was the finest example of appropriate workplace conduct. And she did not smile at him the way she usually did, not with the small, resigned warmth she'd developed as a kind of armor, but with something much more neutral. Something that said, "I see you seeing what you've done. I've been seeing it for 2 years." Reginald did not try to speak to Solene privately. He wanted to. He thought about it constantly. He rehearsed versions of the conversation, the gracious acknowledgement of a misunderstanding, the collegial reset, the implicit request for clemency disguised as professional courtesy. But every version dissolved when he tried to make it real, because every version required him to admit something he wasn't yet ready to name out loud. Meanwhile, Solene continued working. She reviewed the Westhaven gift agreement again. She reviewed the departmental budget records, which were accessible to her as provost. She requested and received a copy of Desmond Farquhar Cole's original complaint. It had been filed with HR, quietly and equally quietly shelved. She read the departmental culture surveys that Petra confirmed existed. She did not read them with anger. She read them the way she had always read difficult documents. The way a doctor reads a chart, looking for the pattern that explains the symptom. She also had 3 conversations with the president of the university, with the chair of the board's academic affairs committee, and with Callista O'Dwyer Remington of the Westhaven Foundation that Reginald did not know about. He had 17 days when this began. He now had 4. The announcement ceremony for the Westhaven Endowment was held on a Friday morning in Hargrove Hall's grand reception room, a high-ceilinged space with arched windows that looked out over the bay, where on a clear day you could see all the way to Marin. It was, for once, a clear day. The fog had pulled back overnight, and the October light came through those windows at an angle that made everything in the room look like it was being lit for a film. There were 62 people in that room. The board of trustees, major donors, senior faculty, the university president, a measured and silver-haired man named Ellsworth Price Callahan, who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of the calm exit. Callista O'Dwyer Remington of the Westhaven Foundation, immaculate and watchful, in a seat near the window, and Petra Voss, who had been invited, at Solene's personal request, to attend as part of the administrative staff. Reginald stood at the front of the room in his best suit. He had prepared remarks. He had prepared them carefully, in the way of a man who understood that words at a moment like this were load-bearing. He looked out at the room and felt, despite everything, the pull of the thing he had always wanted, to be recognized permanently in a place like this. President Price Callahan spoke first, brief and gracious, as always. He welcomed the foundation, thanked the board, noted the significance of the gift for the university's research mission. Then he said, with the smooth and entirely opaque composure of a man who had been briefed, that before the formal announcement, the provost wished to say a few words about the endowment's placement. There was a small, barely perceptible shift in the room. Solene stood. She did not have notes. She never used notes for this kind of moment, because she had found, over many years, that notes created the impression of preparation where presence was more powerful. She thanked the foundation. She spoke briefly and genuinely about the importance of endowed chairs in shaping institutional culture, not just research output, but the values a department projects to its junior faculty, its graduate students, its future hires. She said that a gift of this size was not just financial. It was architectural. It built the kinds of invisible structures that determined what a place felt like to the people who worked inside it. And then she said that, in her 8 months as provost, she had been conducting an assessment of departmental cultures across the university. That this assessment had involved some, here she paused, and something passed across her face that was not quite amusement, not quite sadness, but carried elements of both, unconventional methodology, that she had found it useful in the early months of her tenure to observe the institution without the filter of institutional identity, to understand how people behaved when they didn't know who they were talking to. The room was so quiet that the light coming through the windows seemed to have a sound. She said that the Westhaven endowment was still coming to Caldwell Hargrove, that the foundation's commitment was intact, that she was grateful, and the university was grateful, and the gift would do genuine good. But, under the restructuring provision of the gift agreement, page 42, paragraph 2, she had recommended, and the foundation had agreed, that the endowment would be placed not in the School of Applied Sciences, but in the Center for Research Culture and Faculty Development, a cross-disciplinary body that she was establishing effective immediately, with a mandate to support junior researchers, document departmental practices, and build the kind of institutional culture that a $5 million gift should inhabit. The inaugural director of the center, she said, would be Dr. Desmond Farquhar Cole, who had graciously agreed to return to Caldwell Hargrove in this new capacity. She let that settle for exactly one breath. Then she looked not pointedly, not theatrically, but directly and without apology at Reginald Ashford Belmont. She said, "The School of Applied Sciences remained one of the university's great strengths. Its future, like the future of every department at Caldwell Hargrove, would be shaped by the culture its leadership chose to build." She said she looked forward to working with all departmental leaders on that work. She sat down. Callista Oduya Remington of the Westhaven Foundation was nodding slowly, with the expression of someone watching a long equation finally resolve. Reginald sat very still. His prepared remarks were folded in his jacket pocket. He did not take them out. She thought she had lost everything, but what she discovered that morning would change her forever, and what he discovered about himself in the silence that followed would take years to fully understand. The ceremony ended with applause, not the roaring kind, the measured, appreciative kind that sophisticated rooms produce when they have witnessed something they know matters. People filed out slowly, the way they do when a room has been changed by something and nobody is quite ready to walk back into ordinary air. Reginald left without speaking to anyone. He walked back to his office, closed the door, and sat at his desk. His prepared remarks were still in his pocket. He didn't take them out for a long time. When he finally did unfold them, he read through them once. Then he folded them again and put them in the trash. He stayed in his office until 6 that evening, long after the building had emptied. He thought about Claudette, his mother, who had cleaned other people's offices for 30 years and been invisible in those buildings in the same structural way he had made Solene invisible in this one. He thought about the space between knowing something and feeling it, how it was possible to know the history of a wound and still inflict it, how ambition, unexamined, could transform a person who had survived invisibility into a person who imposed it. He thought about Desmond Farquhar Cole, 29 years old, who had come to him with spreadsheets and a quiet, careful professionalism, and had been answered with contempt. He thought about what that moment had cost, not himself, not Desmond's career ultimately, which seemed by all accounts to be thriving, but what it had cost in the invisible currency of human dignity, in the account that every institution keeps whether or not it knows it. He did not resign. That would come later, or rather, what came later was something more complicated than resignation. What came later was a request. He went to Solene's office, her real office, now renovated and occupied, with a nameplate on the door that read in clean serif lettering, Dr. Solene Marchettiokifor, Provost, and he knocked. And she said to come in. And he sat across from her desk and said simply and without performance that he owed her an apology and that he understood if she had no interest in hearing it. She heard it anyway. She did not absolve him. That was not her role, and she understood the difference between forgiveness, which was personal and hers to give or not, and accountability, which was institutional and already in motion. She said, and this was the thing Reginald would carry with him for the rest of his career, that the most dangerous kind of blindness was not the kind that came from ignorance. It was the kind that came from forgetting, from climbing so far from something that you could no longer see it. Provost, for her part, was offered a position on the staff of the new Center for Research Culture and Faculty Development. She accepted. On her last day in Reginald's department, she took the small notebook from her desk drawer, looked at it for a long moment and put it in her bag. She didn't throw it away. She didn't need to. It had already done what notebooks do. It had held the truth steady until the truth could stand on its own. Desmond Farquhar Cole returned to San Francisco in January. His first act as director of the new center was to establish a formal research mentorship program for postdoctoral fellows, the kind of program that would have protected him, had it existed when he needed it. He named it, with a dry humor that his new colleagues came to love, the Ordinary Documentation Project. In honor, he said, of the power of writing things down. And Solene went home on the evening of the ceremony, walked 3 blocks in the direction of the ocean, and stood for a while at the edge of the park near the sunset where she had played as a girl. The fog was coming in again, rolling off the Pacific the way it always did at this hour. She thought about her mother, who had always said the fog didn't diminish things. It just reminded you that some things couldn't be seen until the conditions were right. She thought about the 30 days the gift agreement had given her, the 17 she had used, the way time used with intention could become something more than minutes. She took a breath of salt air and walked home, and that is when she understood not every loss is the end. Some are the beginning of something greater, and not every act of invisibility is a wound. Sometimes, when chosen deliberately, it is the most powerful thing a person can hold. The fog doesn't announce itself. It just rolls in. Quiet and total, until everything looks different than it did before. Take a moment right now, before you close this, and ask yourself something. Have you ever walked into a room and made a decision in the first 3 seconds about who mattered and who didn't? About who was worth your full attention and who was simply part of the scenery? Most of us have. Most of us do it without even noticing, because the world has spent a long time teaching us exactly who to look at and who to look past. What would you have done in Solene's position? If someone handed you their coat, if someone looked through you with that particular careless ease, would you have corrected them immediately? Or would you have done what she did? Watched, waited, let the truth arrive in its own time in its own room with its own witnesses. And what about Reginald, this man who climbed from nothing, who built something real, and who somewhere in that climb began doing to others what had been done to him? Do you believe people like him can truly change? Or does the architecture of who we've become eventually always hold? Is this a story about justice, about power, about the particular grace it takes to be invisible by choice, on your own terms rather than by someone else's assumption? We'd love to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what hit you hardest. Tell us which character you saw yourself in, because if you watch this honestly, there's something of both of them in all of us. And if this story stayed with you, if you're still thinking about that marble corridor, that coat, that room full of witnesses, then you will not want to miss what we have coming next. We have a story waiting for you about a woman who was told, at 53, that her best years were behind her, about what she built in the years that followed, about the particular, quiet, devastating power of a person who has nothing left to prove. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Share this with someone who needed to hear it today. And carry this with you from this story, if nothing else. The next time you walk into a room and your eyes start deciding who matters, slow down. Look again. The person you're about to look past may be holding something you cannot afford to lose.